So Photoshop could be used in a lot of different ways, guys. The first thing to kind of to notice the difference between the Adobe suite is that they all work very differently, right? So Photoshop works in a rasterized program. So its code, its base of its programming is all rastered images, which means pixelation, which means it's in a pixel set of code, versus Illustrator where it works in a vector set. So a vector, we all kind of know from physics, has information and direction. Usually it's just a more complex code. So you notice the differences in Illustrator and Photoshop. Photoshop we kind of use to manipulate an image, right? Versus Illustrator, we could actually draw perfectly straight lines. We could change those lines, and we could change their code to mean different thicknesses and apply different maskings, all sorts of things. So the tool sets that are in Photoshop are for raster images. So what I've learned in architecture is that Illustrator lines look like crap. There's no humanity in it. It doesn't have my drafted lines that I learned at San Antonio College, that I spend money on all my markers, on all my pens and all my pencils. I didn't waste it on anything, right? So, and I didn't waste this talent either. So what we can do in architecture, and what we are faced as a generation for the digital era of architecture, is hybridizing drawings for presentation, making quick drawings based on the same talents that we have, right? So what's interesting about Photoshop is I relate it to a piano all the time. Now, a piano can be immediately, scary to play. It's got 88 notes. They're all different keys. They somewhat relate to each other. But if I play it in a certain way, I can make music, right? Same thing with Photoshop. These are just tools. The tools by themselves are just notes. And eventually you can actually make a masterpiece with Photoshop. It still requires the same amount of work and rigor and the fundamentals, but it's just a matter of learning these tools, the commands, and everything like that. So what we're going to do for this is basically, this is probably really simple. These are just lines I drew up from the same thing, right? But I drafted these lines in such a way to where that's how I wanted them. I wasn't going to change the thickness, nor was I going to use the computer to make any sort of changes that I could just already draw really quick, right? I drew this in like 30 minutes, where if I were to draw it at this level of humanity in Illustrator or Photoshop, it would take a lot longer, right? If I wanted to get all the imperfections that I make as a human that make my drawing human, right? So what we struggle with in architecture a lot is actually making our drawings seem human. So as you can see, it's definitely lifelike. And everybody knows how to scan, right? Everybody knows kind of what DPI is, that a higher DPI means a more resolution, a finer image. So basically what that translates to is per inch on your drawing, every inch has 300 pixels if it has 300 DPI. If I scan my image, especially drafted images, you want to scan them really high because they're never going to get every single atom on this piece of paper, right? What the scanner is actually doing is picking up the difference between paper and ink. So especially when I scan, I like to do it in black and white. A very base image, maybe grayscale. I usually don't add a lot of color because I know the color is actually a lot more powerful and useful in Photoshop. And I can change it, right? I can change the color too if I market it up or anything. But let's get right into it. So you guys have these tutorial files, and this one's called base lines. So there's a few things we need to do to it before we can start messing with it. But I'm going to basically use it as, you can see right now, everything defaults into Photoshop as a background layer. Unfortunately, a background layer is always locked. It's kind of just to help you not mess up, or if in the case that you do mess up, you have another backup copy. So what I like to do is duplicate it and call it lines. This will be our base image. So in this rastered image, we know that it's black and white, but the computer doesn't actually know anything anything different between this cluster and this cluster of pixels. It knows it as black and white, sure, but it doesn't know to separate them. So we gotta tell the computer to basically do that. So after I have a very pristine image and I've cleaned it up from my scan, because we all know when we scan something, it picks up little things. It's not exactly the clearest image. So that's kind of another tutorial in all of itself, but it has to do basically with curves, fixing the drawing in such a way to where we have white and black. So if I did it automatically, it's going to sort of kind of fix it. If I press white on, you can see the drawing changes its opacity of, or basically its contrast of black and white. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to keep that. And the best thing to notice about Photoshop is that to keep your layers in track. You don't want layer 1, layer 0, level, layer, all these different things that you can't actually read, right? And that you'd have to memorize every time that you open up your Photoshop file. So I know that I'm going to have grass. I don't want to group. Let's select new layer right down here. I think it pops up. Yep, create a new layer. So we'll label this one grass. We know we have streets, sidewalks, and we'll start off with that for now. So, like I said, we need to take our lines away from our white space. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, and I'm going to show you one way. So using the letter command W is a magic wand, and you'll notice this comes up. So basically, what I want to select is the white space. So that's just what I'm going to do. You'll see that it creates this thing. This is actually an outline of every single black part of the image that has been being picked up. So when I press delete, it goes away. And now I just have my lines and some white spaces that we didn't pick up. So basically the magic wand, all it knows is an algorithm to basically select the closest thing to a pixel that it knows. It's basically trying to be smart. So we need to tell it some more information. So I'll do Command deselect or Control D in Windows, and that'll deselect whatever you have. I could do undo and get that selection back if I needed to. That way I didn't have to do it all over again. I'll zoom out a little bit, and I kind of want to get rid of these spaces because I know that they're eventually going to be grass, right? So we'll do the same thing. Highlight it. I can hold Shift and add to my selection. So now this is selected and this is selected even though they're not touching. So I'll keep holding Shift and add all the white space. I kind of like it on the buildings, so I think I'll keep it on the buildings. But we'll take it out of the sidewalks. You'll notice I'll hold space and I can scroll around. I can't actually do anything, but when I'm holding space I can actually pan, which is a very useful tool. As soon as I stop holding, it goes back to my little wand tool. So let's go ahead and select all the white spaces. Let's get it out of there. I like it on my north arrow. That looks pretty good. I don't like it there. Don't want it here. And we'll press delete again. Gets rid of my white space. I could zoom in even more. There's probably little ones I missed like this. The little stairs. So now we have a clean line drawing, but that's kind of hard to look at. So what I like to do is create a new layer, and I call it my white background. Now I'm basically adding the white back. That way I can visually see it better, even though they're actually two separate layers now. So we'll call it white background, and we'll actually place it at the very back. Because when Photoshop is working, it reads these layers in order. So this one is always going to be at the top. So if you had your trees at the top, it's going to show your trees at the top arrangement, right? We all know what arrangement is in the digital world, where we push something back, it actually goes into the background. And when you bring something forward in arrangement, it brings it to the foreground. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're basically just separating those layers. So in the white background, there's nothing in it. if I turn all these off, there's absolutely nothing in my white background. So let's change that. We'll press B for brush. So every single tool has a letter to it that eventually you will memorize, and it will become a lot easier. Simple like playing a piano. You don't memorize all the chords, you memorize how a chord is played, and somehow your brain starts to use that tool to play music. So we'll take our color palette, we'll make it white, and this could be really any color. I mean, if you wanted to have a black background and white lines, you could do that, right? And actually, I'll show you that real quick because you guys have been asking me. Come on. Oh, there it is. Thank you, sir. So yeah, if you still have something selected, it's still only going to apply whatever you're doing to that selection. Suddenly gets dark in here. So instead of a white background, I have a black background, but now my lines don't really show up except kind of that, which kind of looks weird. I could invert this, so I could go to, where is it? Adjustments, invert. It also has a command, so you could even command invert, right? So we can invert it. And now it's the opposite, it's a black and white drawing, right? Not exactly what we want to do today, but you can see how simple we can manipulate our lines, right? These are our lines. These aren't something we got from the internet. These are the ones that we were trained and drafted to do, right? So we can still use them in the digital world. So I'm going to hit Command I again because I don't want that. And I'm going to change this, even though it's selected. So if I had my line selected, it starts to wipe away my lines, which I don't want, right? So you have to make sure that the layer that you're selecting is the layer that you want to work on. It's actually very tedious and it gets very annoying, but the more you put this in routine and realize, oh, I'm working on trees, oh, I'm working on tree shadow, I'm working on this layer, you'll start to cognitively get it in your head what you're working on all the time, and it gets very easy. So let's switch this to a white background. Switch that up. And let's color this thing. So the only thing that we have to trace off of is our baselines, but we don't want to do anything to them, and we kind of want to make sure that nothing happens to them, so I'm going to lock them right here in the dash. So I'll work on grass first, and so basically we have to select what to tell it to make grass. All it knows is that it's the color that I choose. It doesn't actually know that it's grass. Only we know that. So I like to use the Lasso Tool. There's many different ways you can use the Lasso Tool, but since we have so many lines here, and this is actually kind of a complex drawing, there's a lot of different little spaces, there's different line weights, there's all these different little things that I wouldn't limit yourself to when you're drawing, like still go for complexity. This is just how to work with it. So I'll use my polygonal tool. It's a very straight line tool. And I'll basically select everything that I want to be grass. So this basically surface area is now going to be what I want it to be, which means I got to select this surface area by holding Shift and adding to my selection. You'll also notice when you hold Shift, it makes a perfect straight line. That's just how the tools work. Anytime you hold Shift, it'll actually usually take it to be orthographical or do something proportional. If you're moving something, if you're holding Shift, just try it because you'll get different results. Something to kind of just test with yourself. As I'm holding Shift, this goes in a straight line. If I don't hold Shift, I can kind of move it. You guys kind of see that? And it'll hold it at a 45. It'll hold it at 0, negative 45. So it goes in the cardinal directions, right, if I hold Shift. See, I want this big grass piece. We'll get this piece. So when you're tracing, you kind of want to go in the middle of your black line, just because your lines are going to be on top, and they're going to cover sort of any imperfection that you have with tracing, which is kind of nice. Plus, we don't want to see any like little white spaces, and just we want to limit our imperfections. We want to make a perfect drawing, but at the same time, we want it to have our character, right? So this is all grass. Oh, I accidentally clicked twice, and you'll see what that does. It basically automatically closes my drawing, which is not what I wanted, so I'll go back. So it holds my previous selection, right? So we don't lose everything. That's the only thing that kind of sucks about Photoshop, is that even though it does have an undo feature, it's only undoing each tool set. So if you were to actually look at your history, which I believe is this, it actually keeps track of every single little move that I'm making, right? So if I really did make a mistake, like in my magic wand area, and it'll name it by the tool, I could actually go back to that and erase something. If I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning of the drawing, I missed one little thing, I could change that, right? Just food for thought. So let's keep selecting my grass. Actually, let's go back. There we go. All good. Do you guys have any questions so far? As I'm doing this long, tedious thing? You guys are quiet. It's kind of spooky on Halloween. Is anybody dressing up for Halloween? Does anybody do Halloween anymore? Nope. Too old. That, and I don't have any kids, so it's weird. It's like, what are you doing? I like candy. What is that? That's true. That's true. I do attend those. So even though this is a long, tedious process, I only have to do it once. So anything that I've decided to be grass, I can basically always keep it as what I want. Trying to stay on those black lines. It's a little harder on the curves, but you can do it. So we'll say this is our grass, and we basically have to make a base color. That way we kind of know that it's grass, and just to kind of give it the base color. So it says there's nothing in grass, and that's because I don't have it actually viewable. So in order to work on a layer, it does have to be viewable. So we'll work on grass, we'll make sure that it's selected, and I'll basically highlight my selection. So now I have this layer. This is basically the extent of what I traced, right, based on my own lines. So right now it kind of looks funky, right? My lines are in the way. I kind of still need my lines to go through. It's in the wrong arrangement, right? So if I make lines on top, now the lines, those black lines are immediately on top, and it looks pretty good. Still looks a little too digital, right? So how can we get around that? Basically, we give it some texture. So what I like to do to my base layer is make it a little transparent, a little more grass-like, to see it a little better. You can start to see a little bit of my imperfections, and I'll show you how to get rid of that later. So now we have my grass highlighted, and we can texturize it. So in another file, so basically you're going to have to scan a lot. So I have my texture sample, and this is just me on marker. I just drew a little swatch of it. We all know how to do this, right? We can color. What I like to do is I like to use grayscale. Just because in the digital world I can always add color to something more physical. So this is a very physical object. It's what I drew with my marker, and basically I want the physicality of it. So I want the unpredictability of this stuff, right? This is the bread and butter. This is my DNA, literally right here, right? This is the only person who can draw it this way. Which is why it's not a good idea to steal from the internet this stuff, because sometimes it's in a different format. We could do it a lot quicker. We could spend all day looking for trees that are drawn like us, right? Or we could draw our own trees at every single scale with every single shadow curve, right? And we could place that drawing over and over, my perfect tree, instead of drawing a tree 40 million times in your lifetime, right? Instead, you drew the perfect one already, and you scanned it so well at 900 DPI that you could use it all the time in every drawing. So that's kind of what I've done. And if I showed you my list of files, I have actually real stuff because I do digital renderings too, right? So in digital rendering, we would kind of do the exact same thing. We would take a picture of, say, this chalkboard, and that would become chalkboard texture for the render program, right? Whether it's Revit, Lumion, Encore, any of them. So basically we need to put this in my drawing. So I did two different ones. This is kind of a light texture, right? It's obviously, well, as you can see on the screen, there's absolutely nothing. But in my screen, it actually looks pretty good. You could probably see that a lot better. So we'll take that one. Basically, we're going to highlight it. We're going to Control C or Command C. And I'm going to literally create a layer, call it texture. In this case, we'll call it grass texture, just so we know what it is. And we'll put it next to my grass. So it's in the grass layer. When I click paste, it'll actually go to the grass texture layer, right? So now we need to make this green look like I did it in marker. So how do we do that? We literally get my marker and put it in Photoshop. So what we can do is Control T, and I can change this around. So I want to put it at a 45. I kind of want to make it look sort of with the topography. And you'll notice it doesn't actually cover the whole thing. I could do that, but it also scales my image, right? It makes it look like I had a giant marker while I was doing this, which is not what we want. We want it to be realistic. So we want to keep that scale, and we just want to copy it over and over again. So I'll get something that looks nice. You know, this line is looking okay. I don't want any sort of, like, we don't want to see this line or, you know, all the imperfections that the grass doesn't cover, right? So basically what we can do is we can get the most of it, like say in this area, that pretty much encapsulates all this area, right? Kinda, at least this will be uniform in terms of this swatch. So we'll press enter, and I like that one, so I'm going to select it again. I use my magic tool for everything except that. I'll probably just take another one. So copy and paste. Now you'll see it created a new layer because I wasn't in my grass layer, and I don't want that. Definitely want it in my grass layer. So we'll scale that up. And now this we can sort of align with others to make it look realistic. So I can take this one, enter there, paste, transform. It's kind of a process, but I only have to do it once. We'll get this little portion right here, paste. Say what? Yeah, I'll just merge them, and I'll show you how to basically just work with all these anomalies. So basically what we're doing is we're covering all the green space. I could even stack them. Whatever looks most realistic, right? I could even stretch it a little bit, make it work. Match that one right there. So do you guys see what I'm doing? I'm basically copying and pasting and making a mask, is what they would say. So obviously we don't need all this leftover space, and also I don't want to trace this all over again. It's also inaccurate, right? So basically what I can do is I can select my grass layer and use my magic wand and basically select those colors again without having to trace them, which is really useful because now I can turn my grass off. I can go into my select tool. So anytime that you're trying to change or manipulate your section, you have to be back in that tool. It's really frustrating, but you have to get used to it. So I want to edit basically this swatch, but it's also a bunch of different layers. So what I can do is I can take my grass texture, highlight all of them, and basically I can merge visible, I can merge layers, and I can flatten image. So these all three do different things. If I flatten the image, that'll take all the layers and put them together, which is not what we want. The merge visible will take everything that's right here, which also works in this situation because it is visible, right? It'll merge the visible, or I can just merge the layers that are selected, and it'll merge just those layers. So in this case, I'll just merge those layers. So now that they're all one, I could say grass texture. Now we have that, and now I want to get rid of all this. So I press E for erase. Pretty simple. If I right click in my tool, this is where I can make all my diameter changes or radius changes, the hardness. So I'm going to make it a little bigger. And basically, I'm erasing the wrong one, aren't I? Right? We want to keep the inside. So basically what we do, we go back to our select tool, right click, and we select the opposite. So basically what it's going to do, instead of selecting this object, it's going to select the void, right? We all know about void solid relationships. So when I select the inverse, now you'll see that it's actually highlighted this part, right? So now when I go back to E and erase on the right layer, I'll erase this side. And basically does all the work for me. So there's stuff like this that we could fix too in this layer. Honestly, there's a million different ways you could solve this, but one of the best ones I like to use, especially in a complex image like this, is the clone tool. I forgot the command for it though. It's a stamp, right? Okay. Clone stamp tool. So this one works really cool, and it works in a special way. So you'll notice if I hold Alt, the command Alt, it brings up this little dot. What that dot is where I want to clone from. So since I'm covering this, I'll probably want to take this clone, right? So I'll press Alt, click, and then when I you'll see that there's two now, right? So basically it's making a copy, but right now I'm actually selected on the outside, so I gotta switch back. There we go. Grass texture, clone tool, alt, and basically fix. Simple as that. You guys see how that worked? I could do the same thing right here, but it's gonna be, you can kind of see it in the screen, but there's like another dot following this dot. I need to reset my dot and fix it again. So you can start to see I blend these edges to where it looks like I did it still, right? It doesn't look like I did it in Photoshop. This line's another one of them. And I could do a lot of different things, right? So that was the clone tool. And there's something called a dodge tool, which starts to basically highlight the space so you can add, imperfections. Make it look more realistic. Stuff like that. So now that we got that, we got our grass layer. That's starting to look a little more realistic, right? It's starting to look like grass. We can mess with it some more. So I can go to my grass texture. I can do Command L for layers, and I can start to look at what it's doing, right? So what I'm manipulating is the texture layer. I'm not manipulating the color. So basically, this is a trial and error thing. This is what I print out, and I'm like, that looks good, that looks bad. Sure, this is what it looks like on screen, but I know it prints well. So that's something you kind of just have to test on your own. So I kind of like it dark. Looks pretty good. My grass, I kind of want to change the color up. But it actually looks really flat, right? So what do we do when something's flat? We basically we take its contrast and we separate it, right? We make really lights light and we make really darks dark, and that starts to make things pop. So what we can do is literally contrast. So we can do a color balance, we can do vibrance. Vibrance is kind of cool. It just basically, it's not very cool to one color, but basically it turns from grayscale to a very saturated green. I use it in photos a lot, and you can also control the saturation. Not sure what that's doing there. So how would we get rid of something like that? I could still take my same selection, I could inverse it, and basically get rid of that shit. So cool, I got my grass, I kind of like it. Let's see how it looks with the lines. All right, we're getting somewhere. So now we have something that at least looks like the marker that I did. So maybe it doesn't look quite much. Maybe I could change the scale of my strokes. I could do different scans of basically different marker strokes, right? So I could have like 0.5, 0.1, 0.005 line types. I could really get crazy with this, right? So now we have our grass, we have our texture, and I want to group these together because I don't want it to get mixed up. So we'll group from layers, we'll call it grass. That way, anytime that I need to add more grass, like in this situation, I need to go back and add grass, I can always go back to this open layer, or I can just turn off grass completely. So we have our lines, we have our grass, we can do our streets now. So there's a lot of tricks to this. So I could either finish the rest of my grass, I could finish the sidewalks, and then everything that's not that, I could make streets, right? Which would be an easier step. Or, I could just do it one at a time. It really doesn't matter. That kind of breeds inconsistency, but honestly, for learning, I would encourage you to just go at this program, because the best way of learning it is YouTube videos, watching me do it, watching somebody else do it, saying, how did you do that? Show me how to do that. Here's a way of doing that. Here's a simple way of doing that. How many clicks was that? We used to have this thing at Texas Tech where it was like, well, it took about 900 clicks. And like, that's a lot of work. And so when somebody said like, oh, it only took about 100 clicks, I'd be like, well, dude, show me how you did it. You know, it only took 100 clicks. Does anybody know the average that a mouse can handle in terms of clicks? It's 10 million. Just a weird fact. There's engineers that test these things. Okay, moving on. So we got our streets, got our sidewalks. We can kind of do the same process for each. Our streets, basically doing the same masking technique for buildings. So what do you guys want to work on? Actually, let's add some trees. So you'll notice there's no trees in here, there's actually dots where the trees are located. So instead of drawing trees with circles, just because there's not a single tree in the entire universe that's a perfect circle, I promise you. Nor will there ever be. So we know how to draw trees, so let's put them in. I already have my tree sample, and I have it in a relatively number of styles and different ways. This one I actually made in like 2015. It's not my greatest trees. I should probably redraw them because they're going to be copied over and over again. But basically, I would start to select a tree that I fit appealing for the drawing, right? Basically, I could do that a number of ways. I could just simply copy and highlight the tree, or I can edit it in here. Maybe it's not the way I want it, so let's level it up a little bit. I like it a little dark. I want to get rid of the white space, so how do we do that? Just get rid of it. It's still on the background layer, so I still have to do that same thing where I duplicate a layer, put that off in the background. Basically, just want to delete. I don't know. It's pretty debatable. Some people have success with the white space, some people don't. It really just depends on what you want to do. This tree is looking pretty good. This tree is looking pretty good. I'm going to take those. So what I could do, I can simply select that. I can literally move it. I can copy it and basically put it in there. So it still has its white space. I don't want that, right? So what I can do is I can turn off all my layers if it makes it simpler to see. It's only going to affect my tree layer because only my tree layer is affected. But this is honestly an easier way to look at it, right, instead of everything around it. So it's not the greatest scanned image. It's got some texture. My line weights are kind of fat. And you'll start to recognize when you're scanning that you're like, man, I'm not really great at drawing at all. Like, and you'll start to actually improve your drawing based on what you're seeing, especially at this. It's like getting a microscope. You're never going to look at the tree this close, right? But what's weird in digital architecture, especially in AutoCAD, we can zoom in forever. We can zoom out forever, which like that's what the digital revolution is about, is literally no limitation. But humans aren't good at no limitation, so we devise tools to give ourselves limitation. Anyway, I want to get rid of the white space. So I do, using the magic wand. So now that that's completely done, we got to figure out where to put them. Now this one obviously has its shadow already created. You can do it in multiple different ways. You could add the shadows digitally. I wouldn't recommend adding a digital component next to a drawn component because you'll notice the difference, right? So let's just put my drawn one in. It's kind of at a different angle. I'd kind of like it more maybe at this angle. So we'll take my tree, and I kind of want to see the background of it, so we can basically change its opacity or fill so we can see it a little bit better, and move it. I can use the arrows to get a fine tune, and that looks pretty good. So I'll copy that and paste it again, although that one's unedited, so we kind of want my edited version. So the best way we could do that is just select it. So I know that layer is a lot easier to select, and then I select the inverse, and now I've got this. So Command C for copy. I need to know where to put it, and I basically have that one. I can set it back down. And basically, voila, I don't have to draw a tree. So this tree now looks taller, and that might be something you just need to draw out, or possibly pick a double tree. So we can take that one. And put that one in. So it's at 2 different angles. I got to fix that. I'll basically move them to about the same angle. Let's get rid of that one, get rid of that one. Transform it a little bit. More realistic. A little bigger. So now I have my trees, but you'll notice something's kind of weird with their transparency. So I basically just have to make these decisions. That tree I'm no longer using, so I can delete it. Yes. No longer using that tree, so I can delete it. Delete layer. Yes. Just like that. So instead of copying what's actually in the layer, I can copy the layer itself as well, which might be more beneficial. So I can copy layer style, I can copy CSS, which I have no idea what that means. So basically all I want to do is Control C. That's not what I want. Actually, I think there's multiple ways you can hold Alt and it makes another tree. So if you hold Alt and move your tree, you can obviously start to make more. Put that one there. So I can't just simply click on the other tree, right? I actually have to make sure that the layer is selected. I don't want them to look all the same, so we'll change them up a little bit. But you start to get the idea. Let's change our street because it's looking way too white. At the same time, these trees are getting confusing, so I'm going to stack them up. Or at least group them. Trees. So let's work on our streets. I want my grass out of the way, I want my trees out of the way. He got out of there somehow. Put him back in the trees. So now we got my line drawing again. And now we want to get my streets. So there's multiple ways we could do that. The best way is honestly just to trace it. We'll go off the page. But now I have this selection, so I kind of want to add to my selection, obviously, the other line. Goes in a little bit. Oh. I should probably get that street too, but I'll skip it. And I messed up. Saddest part about Photoshop is if you mess up, you gotta do it again. It's okay, you get better every time. I'm in trees, don't want to be in trees, be in streets. I'm internally screaming. Especially since this is on video now too.
So in my class, what I want you to do is to look for precedents. Right? I'm not talking about, I'm talking rendering precedents. Right? Look at like Plato, look at all the partners, look at, do you have in Photoshop? You know, that's what I'm saying. You're going to be rendered in Photoshop. Let's look for precedents in Photoshop. How do architects present their ideas? They don't use these garish colors. They're not pulling texture out of brick texture and putting brick texture. It's an abstraction, right? That make sense?
So basically right now we're just getting all the streets. All the surface area that is the street. So now that I got this selection, I need to add sort of the outside of that selection, or I can just select the inverse. And now I have that outside. So what I can do is now do the same exact thing I did with the grass, right? I can give a texture, I can give a color. I'm going to give a color first. I like to give color first because it just kind of helps me understand usually what it is. Streets, and we're basically going to get all the street. Now it's going to look crazy. It's going to look like we lost some lines, but the street is also one of the lowest layers too. So you have to kind of think about what you're layering as well. So obviously my grass goes above my streets. Obviously my lines go probably to the top. Maybe not surpass trees. Trees are probably on the top. And so my streets look really weird. Even though it's layered okay, I think I'm kind of missing some lines. So what's nice about this is I can duplicate pretty easily and put my trees back. So now I get a pretty good digital hybrid image, especially when it comes to these layers right here. there's really not a lot that the untrained mind would probably recognize, right? They would probably assume that it's in computer, but they would be like, "Did you draw it?" And that's kind of the effect that we want. We want somebody to have that sort of ambiguous connection between our drawings that are like, they still made it with craft, but now there's a digital element that has its accuracy to it now, right? So the street's kind of bland. I don't really like it. So we're going to texturize it. We'll texturize it with the same one. Copy. And basically do the exact same thing. I'll show you what it looks like out of scale. And what we can actually do with it too. Streets. Magic wand. I don't want to do it to layer 4. Do it to streets. Select inverse. Actually, select inverse again. Erase. Inverse. Erase. Nope. There we go. So right now you can't actually see it, but I'm erasing basically where I don't want the texture of my streets. If I wanted to see it real quick, I could always give it some transparency, right? Obviously that scale is way too big, right? But there's plenty of things I could do to it. So once you have things even set up, and everything's kind of in place, right? There's still actually even more we can do in terms of editing the layers, or we could actually highlight certain elements that are really only we can get digitally. So I could say my lines aren't dark enough, I could make them darker, right? So I can still change a lot of different things. I could still change layer 4, you know, the texture pattern. Perhaps my entire cropping is a little off. So I could do something. There we go. I can start to edit my drawing as a whole. Press enter, and now I'm getting somewhere, right? So this is kind of just a tutorial of this. It's pretty much the exact same thing for all the surface areas. So I would do the same thing to buildings, right? So I'd create a layer for buildings. Since this is on the bottom, I can still put my grass layer, add it to this, and put it on top, right? I can put all my trees, I could put people, I could put information, text, any sort of thing to this drawing that now is a hybrid drawing, right? It's completely a hybrid. I drew it, and same time Photoshop helped. Any questions? What do you got?
I was wondering if you guys have like a color palette, like kind of how you did for color pencils or markers.
Right.
Like paint color paintings or something.
Unfortunately, there isn't, because this printer, it has 16 million different colors, 16 million point one different colors. And the only way for it to really know is what the computer tells it. So what you can do is you can scan the color palette that we have in our markers, and you can recognize those colors with Adobe and basically copy the same colors over and over again. But the thing about that is, even though I copy the exact same color, the digital color, when I print it out, it won't be the exact same. For some reason, it never is. I mean, this is why color is actually one of the professional degrees. You can get a degree in color theory. because it is such a very complex scientific measurement, especially when we do stuff like this, right? So my best advice for that is to honestly print it out, especially since you guys have free printing. Like, print it out. Even just little swatches. It doesn't have to be the whole drawing. It could just be a certain section. You can be like, this is working. This is what I want. So you can go back to the screen and be like, all right, I can use my little eyedropper tool, which is Command I. And basically when I select that, it'll actually select the color that it is, right? So I could do that to my own scans if I wanted to say, get my olive green that's in my marker that's just so perfect. Or I could actually just color it out and use that color swatch. Same thing I did as a texture, right? You could actually have 1,000 different scans of all your drawings and never have hands again. You can never, and still have your drawings, if that makes sense.
We need to say it's more efficient to use this as opposed to just actually doing it by hand.
Right. So the only thing that this really helps us is that we can change it. Is that we can label it with text or other information, or usually I can make this a lot quicker if I don't have all my pencils and all my drawings. A lot of the times at the firms, they don't use this stuff anymore. So I actually have my hard drive with all my things on it. And then I'll do stuff at home, I'll scan it, and kind of use it because at a firm, they're kind of just like, give me a site plan. Okay, well, what do I only have what I learned in school, and based off of kind of like what SMU was saying, look at like Plato's product. What do they do? What does their firm sort of cultivate? Because each firm kind of has a different way they do this, but they all do it in Photoshop. They all do it in Illustrator, and usually it's only the principal architect now that even knows how to draw. Honestly, the people that I work with have no freaking clue and don't want to know how to draw. So it's honestly quite an epidemic in terms of San Antonio College, where we're one of the only 3 architecture schools that teach drawing in the nation. And it's one of the best. It hasn't been voted that or anything, but when you ask actually a lot of the older professors and the architects nationwide, they've all heard of San Antonio College. It's actually a very prominent school. Which is why we're so important in this generation, because we are baffled with computers, but at the same time, we don't want to be machines. We're not machines. And every day, the government and all these different organizations are slowly trying to create machines out of us, and we're not. And honestly, it's the architect's moral and ethic responsibility to make sure that we really don't turn into people living in machines and be machines. With that being said, this kind of concludes the quick Photoshop tutorial. I'll be around to answer questions. We have about an hour left to start working on these drawings, work on them together. I know for my class, we're going to talk about the first iteration on Monday. I'm not sure about the other classes. I can sort of update you professors where you're at, but I'd really take a stab at it right now in the next hour. Ask questions. I'll be right here. Sound good? If somebody can turn on the lights for me.